What can be said about David Yount, my dad-in-law? I call him David WWW Yount. I started that back when the internet was brand new, and he'd always chuckle about that. I love teasing him, and I teased him about how great a man he was because he was so humble that even in his final days, I would joke about the statue they were building in the heart of Manila, the 90-foot statue that was being built at the corner of Artigas in Makati, and I would make up words because I don't really know Manila. I've only been blessed to be there once. But I've never in my whole life known a person or a man as great as him, as generous as him, and really anyone who lived for others like him. You know, at first, David was just the obstacle to the girl that I had a crush on. You know, some of you know I got to know my wife as a pen pal, saw her in a slideshow in high school, thought she was cute, and so I wrote a letter. And we became pen pals, and eventually I got this deep burden for the Philippines. Those Filipinos needed the Lord. And so I wrote to David, and I said, I have this deep burden for the Philippines. I would like to come and be mentored by you and discipled by you. But he'd seen the mail, and he knew my ulterior motive. So he wrote back to me and said, get a year of Bible school first, kid. I think he hoped I'd go off to Bible college and get my eyes on another girl. And so I did. I went to Bible college for a year. I tried dating, but none of those girls could compare to my pen pal. And so after a year of Bible school, I wrote back and I said, I still feel this burden for the Philippines. And so he let me come. I figured that was better than work for him for 7 years and get her sister. If you know your Bible, you get that joke. So I went there, and he tried to keep me busy. I did over 80 magic shows, little evangelistic programs in the 6 weeks that I was there. But Sarah and I found time to date. But I had to meet with him every week, and I'd been there about a week, and I went into my weekly meeting with him on Wednesday, and he sat me down, and he said, all right, you've been here a week. How many boys are you discipling? I said, none. I didn't know what he meant. I'm a pastor's kid. I go to Moody Bible Institute. I've been a Christian since I was 4. You know, I mean, I was a veteran Christian, and I was too embarrassed to ask him what he meant by that. So I just said none, but I'm working on it. And he said, well, by next week, I want you discipling at least 3 young men. So I walked out of his office without a clue. I went to Sarah thinking she's going to help me out here. And I said, Sarah, your dad wants me discipling 3 young men by next week. And she said, great, that'd be wonderful. She was no help. So my motive, really, to impress this girl's dad, I walked up to 3 boys in the back of the church. One happened to be Dennis, Dimangondayao. And I said, hey, would you guys like to be discipled? Having no idea what those words meant coming out of my mouth. And they said, you would disciple us? Yeah. Well, let's go get the How to Grow book. What's that? They led me to the back of the church. I offered to buy the book so generously. One of them said, aren't you going to get the Leader's Guide? Oh, yeah, of course. I got the Leader's Guide. And I began to disciple them. And I quickly learned that everybody in this church knew what discipleship was. They'd either been discipled or wanted to be discipled and were just looking for disciplers. I showed up the next week. I was really impressed. I thought he would be. And I said, I'm discipling 4 young men. He said, great. How many people you led to Christ this week? You've been here 2 weeks. None. He handed me some peace tracts. And so I get over to the mall and start sharing the gospel. Once again, just to impress the dad of this girl I had a crush on, I got out of there and walked over to the mall and started sharing the gospel. It's like, there's something different about this guy. And I came to learn there really was something different about this guy. Everywhere he went, he led people to Christ. There was nobody that he encountered that he would not share the gospel with. And I could take an hour to tell you stories of a church pictorial directory lady who came to our church just to meet with us about a church pictorial directory. I, as another pastor on staff, assumed she was a Christian. I mean, good grief, she works for a church pictorial directory company. Her entire job is meeting with pastors. And when she went in to meet with Pastor Dave, he asked her the diagnostic questions. If you were to die tonight, would you go to heaven? She said, I think so. He said, why do you think so? Well, I work for a church pictorial directory company, she probably said. Or maybe she said because my parents were Christians. Or maybe she said because I go to a good church. Or maybe she said, I try to be a good person. Whatever she said, he said, those are the wrong answers. Can I show you from the Bible the correct answers? I wasn't in there for the conversation, but I know she came out of his office in tears, telling the entire church staff, I'm a Christian. I've just asked Jesus to be my Savior. Because he had this process that he just took people through. One time he showed up at the office with his wrist completely black and blue and bruised. And we said, what happened? He said, well, I was at a red light and I was trying to hand a peace tract to a cop in the car next to me. My foot slipped off the gas and my watch caught on his mirror as my car went forward and it gouged into my arm. So then the cop pulled over and said, what were you trying to give me? And he said, I was trying to give you a peace tract to make sure that you'll go to heaven when you die. And he led that cop to the Lord. Everywhere we went, he led people to Christ. They did give me 1 week off that 8 weeks in Baguio. We went up to Baguio, which is a really nice resort town. I don't know if resort's the right word, but I got a week off. We're up there, and down where we were staying, there were some machine gun toting guards. He said, I'll be right back. And he went down with his peace tracts and led these guys with machine guns to Christ. I don't witness to people with machine guns. I figured that's somebody else's job. He was an evangelist. Everywhere he went, he just shared the gospel with people. He also was one of the most generous people I know. He was constantly giving. Everything he owned belonged to the Lord. I had the privilege of knowing some of the giving that he gave that no one else knew about because I would be at the elder deacon meeting when every month our church took a deacon offering, which was kind of extra money to give to needs in the church. And there'd be a request for a college Bible student who would need some funds for school, and the deacon fund wouldn't have the money. And they'd say, oh, we're going to have to reject this. And he would reach into his wallet or take out his checkbook and say, nope, tell them it's covered. And he would write a personal check, and he would put that in there. But the student wouldn't know it came from Dave. They would think it came from the deacon's fund because he wrote the check right there in the meeting to cover that. He would give money that had been set aside for tires on his car, and then he wouldn't have the money. And then someone would come to him and say, Pastor, we notice your tires are bad. We would like to buy you new tires for your car. Not knowing he had just spent the money for the tires on something else. God always provided for him. And I saw through my father-in-law the old saying, you can't outgive God. He proved that true over and over again. He was a disciple maker. He was always discipling people. Even in his retirement, he had people at his home that he was always discipling and challenging others to be discipled. I admire him so much. In fact, we were out to dinner, and one of our family jokes that we were even getting a chuckle out of him in his final days when he could hardly express, and we weren't always sure if he was hearing what we were saying as we continued to talk to him in those final days. I could always get a chuckle out of him. And sometimes the caretakers would look at me like, what in the world? Because I would go up to him in his room and I would say, you want to hear a sermon? And we'd see the slightest smile. And that's because many years ago we were out at a restaurant and the waitress was serving us, and she just very politely making conversation, you know, where you don't really want the answer, you're just being nice. She said, what do you do for a living? And he said, I'm a preacher. And she said, oh, that's nice. He said, you want to hear a sermon? And she looked at her watch. She thought he was going to start preaching right there at the table. She said, well, I have other tables to cover. And that became a running joke for decades where we just say, you want to hear a sermon? Because he was always ready to preach a sermon. So even in those final days, I could get a chuckle out of him by just asking him if he'd want to hear a sermon. I'm just going to end with one fun story of what an amazing man and what an amazing preacher he was. The Dimangondayos might remember this story. It was one of those cantatas at New Hope Church, and I am not a great actor nor a great singer, so I got a pretty easy role in this cantata. I got to be one of the disciples who had no speaking lines. So my job was just to cry when Jesus was dying on the cross, and it was a really easy role because my back was to the audience, so all I had to do was shake my shoulders. and just looked like I was sobbing. And we had a guy in the church playing Jesus. The guy that's in good physical shape and's got a beard gets to be Jesus, right? And so we built this really cool cross that could just be pushed up, and then it had the little spike that goes in to hold the cross up. And this guy who was, looking like Jesus was up there on the cross, and he was standing on this slanted thing, and he had his hands, like this through the spikes up there. And we had lots of rehearsals, but I don't know if we never did it all the way through, or if in rehearsals we let this guy get off the cross a little bit. But at the actual cantata, he had to be up on that cross for a long time. And he's up there on the cross, and he's wearing just the loin thing, and the lights are on, and he's got the thorns on his head, and his legs are bent. And at some point during this dramatic crucifixion scene, his legs buckled, and I'm down there doing my shoulder shaking and sobbing. Jesus falls off the cross right down onto the disciples. And everyone panics. You hear in the audience a little bit of chuckling, and then everyone gets it together because you can't laugh at Jesus falling off the cross. You're thinking, oh no, this is a disaster. The cantata is destroyed. What's Jesus going to do? But the choir just kept singing. Jesus gets back up. He climbs back up on the cross. Good actors, professional. The show must go on. But everyone's kind of like, that's what everyone's going to be talking about after the show, when Jesus fell off the cross. Pastor Dave gets up there at the end for the final wrap-up, and he starts into this story. And he says, one time there was this little boy with his grandfather, and they were telling the story of the crucifixion. And the grandson asked his grandpa in the middle of the story, he says, but Grandpa, what if Jesus fell off the cross? Would we still get saved? And the grandpa turned to his grandson, and you can picture Pastor Dave's voice. He said, grandson, if Jesus fell off the cross, he loves you so much, he would crawl back up on that cross just for you. That's how much he loves you. And there wasn't a dry eye in the place. And then he proceeded to share the gospel. And I think more people got saved in that cantata perhaps than maybe any other cantata. And afterward, the buzz was, what genius to write a cantata where Jesus falls off the cross, and then to end it with that powerful story. There were people who thought that was the plan. That was just a pastor save. That was a genius pastor save. I tell that story all the time. One of the greatest service saves, when my father-in-law knew how to take what could have been a disaster and a distraction and to turn it into a powerful gospel story. And that's what he did. That's who he was. Because all he cared about was people's souls, sharing the gospel, and pointing people to Jesus. He could take any situation. In fact, I'll tell you one more I loved. We were at Dunkin' Donuts on a morning, and we go into Dunkin' Donuts, and there's a whole bunch of construction workers sitting there, and it's a beautiful day. So Pastor Dave walks up to these construction workers, and he goes, shouldn't you guys be out working? And they say, we can't work today. And he looks outside again. He says, why can't you be working? And they said, well, there's rain in the forecast, and we're foundation layers. And you can't lay a foundation if there's rain in the forecast. And he goes, wow. He goes, that's kind of how it is with our life. We've got to lay a foundation when things are good because the storms are coming. And he starts preaching to these guys about the wise men built his house on the rock because the storms are going to come. And he goes into a sermon to these guys sitting at Dunkin' Donuts and starts sharing the gospel. And I'm sitting there going, I just wanted a donut. And this guy's preaching a sermon, but I have used that in sermons. Sarah has heard me tell the Dunkin' Donut construction worker story in my sermons. Everywhere he went, he took whatever situation, whatever was going on, and he turned it to Jesus. What an amazing example for all of us, to see people as lost people, to be generous and not worry about whether we can afford it, and to be a discipler and a mentor of others. Because as we've seen through all these stories, whether they came by video from the Philippines or from around here, the legacy of our life is not going to be anything we accomplished. It's going to be the investment we made in other people. And while my initial interest was that cute girl on the slide, who I did get to meet and marry, one of the bigger blessings was that I got to meet her dad. And I feel so lucky to have been one of his many investments by getting to work with him and getting to be his son-in-law.
The Lord said, I will build my church and the gates of hell won't prevail against it. And we wanted to be in a business where he guaranteed success. And so we asked, where in the world? People seem to be very open to the gospel, and they said, Manila is the place to go.